Look, thanks for this opportunity to present today. I guess thanks also to my co-author, Stu Charters from Lincoln University. He really helped sort of shape the ideas that I'm presenting today. I'm from CQ University, CQ University, we have a strong sort of research agenda in developing and applying emerging technologies for livestock agriculture, such as things like remote automated performance recording, like walkover weight, as well as on animal sensors. I will just say that the focus of our work is predominantly in Northern Australia. The sun is just rising here in central Queensland, which is great. But I guess that sort of reflects my perspectives on the opportunities to a certain extent, although I have worked previously in the UK, but it's very much focused around sort of more industrialized agriculture. So this talk aims to consider, I guess, how livestock farming might shape future livestock management. I really enjoyed the talk just previously from Chris. I thought it was very interesting, his perspective on some of the challenges and opportunities. And I really like the use of his terms, knowledge intensive. I think that really sets the scene nicely for what technology might be able to deliver in terms of fenceless farming. So I guess the challenge in covering such a broad topic is, the technology is not really fully developed at this point in time. And I will talk to some of that in this talk. But this talk really is about the thoughtscapes component, looking to the future and what those opportunities might provide going forward. So in the talk, I'm going to consider the role of the fence and maybe some limitations and why virtual fencing might be important. I'll talk a little bit about the technology and where the technology is up to and how it works. And I'll also talk a little bit to the broader opportunities for virtual fencing and how it might provide those connections with consumers. I really like this Banksy image as it conveys some of those really interesting ideas and I guess talk to somewhat of the irony of how we access food. And I think really for virtual fencing and fenceless farming, it's about connections that shape the landscape. Virtual fencing could certainly revolutionize grazing landscapes. And in some ways, this talk sort of explores how the technology can reconnect us in the landscape. And there are three key elements that underpin that future opportunities. It's really about the landscape and livestock and those interactions. So I'll talk a little bit about that. There is obviously the technology component, which will be used to shape that and the people. So I guess the talk will think about the landscape drivers. It will talk about what it might mean for people. And at each stage of the talk, I'm going to provide a little bit of a framework for each of those individual elements. I certainly think that industrial agriculture has a long history of building reliable food supply chain. So the first part of this talk is thinking about the landscape and why we might consider fenceless farming systems. In preparing the paper for this talk, I was certainly challenged by putting it into both a spatial and a temporal context. And certainly agricultural production systems around the world have been and continue to be highly variable. And this little cartoon is a really an oversimplification of, I guess, the backdrop to the history of how fences came into existence. But I think it does capture the idea that agriculture has really tried to, I guess, use technologies to move forward and ensure food security. And in many ways, we've been very, very successful in taking these technologies and applying them in the context of providing more productive and efficient food production systems. I think what's more interesting, though, is as we look going forward, particularly in more industrialized food production systems, this challenge that we face now, where consumers are increasingly interested in driving value, and connection and meaning. And I'm going to talk a little bit more in a bit more detail about some of where we sit in that broader context. So the fence throughout history has helped to manage and control access. And humans have constructed some amazing boundaries. The Great Wall of China is a great example of that. But there's also equally impressive constructs that have not always been designed to I guess, control livestock, but also to control pests. And Australia has both its fair share of introduced species that it's had to control, but also equally impressive fencing systems that have been developed to control those. It's interesting that both the dingo fence and the rabbit-proof fence both claim to be the longest fences in the world. I think, though, the suburban fence is perhaps the closest most people get to understanding how useful a fence can be. You know, whether it's keeping their pets in the backyard or stopping the neighbors wandering through. But it's become quite synonymous with ownership, and it provides a boundary to keep people out. And I acknowledge that there are many arable farming contexts where there aren't any fences, but people do still remain disconnected. But as a metaphor, I think, for the state of our agricultural production systems and the landscapes and the connections with people, I think it's really important to consider how the fence has shaped those relationships. It's also worth noting that not all livestock need to be contained by fences. So the picture in the bottom left is Herdwick sheep in the Lake District, where the sheep have actually learned to stay in their particular areas without the needs for fencing. So fences are not necessarily the solutions in all situations. In the paper I wrote, I utilized the tragedy of the commons as a framework. I think it's really an interesting, I guess, backdrop for how we think about shared ownership and shared responsibility for that grazing landscape. And it's very interesting that Garrett Hardin utilized the example of common grazing lands. And again, I realize and recognize that there have been lots of developments and opposing theories around selfish motives and how that relates to common grazing. But it's certainly true that the fence, in a way, takes away the need for that responsibility. It assigns it directly through the delineation of that landscape. So it creates these fixed hard boundaries that we can assign responsibility, and the consequences of overgrazing are directly impacting the owner of that particular plot of land. I think if we look to wild animals in the landscape, and I really like this paper by Jolly and colleagues, where they mapped the longest terrestrial migrations and movements around the world. As I prepared this paper, I was just really interested to try and explore what the natural movement of animals are in the landscape. And it's pretty phenomenal when you see some of the large migratory species around the world, how much they move across those landscapes, and how barriers can potentially, impact on that migration, those migration patterns. And it really opens up, in my mind, what would it look like if we were to take migration, those principles, and apply them in our modern agricultural systems? Fences are clearly designed to contain animals to certain areas, but how would that look if we were to take away those fences? I don't think we have a really clear picture of how virtual fencing and fenceless farming will be used, but it's certainly clear that the need to manage landscapes is challenged, I guess, by the blunt tools of things like adjusting stocking density or moving watering points or supplementary feed. They're not sufficiently refined, and I think the paper here by Hudson and colleagues, where they take the anecdotal collection of risks and benefits, and they apply those, and it really does demonstrate how in good years there's an oversupply and in poor years there's an undersupply. And in some ways, that spatial and temporal resolution that we apply with our modern fences makes it very difficult to to manage the landscape in a way that really optimizes the opportunities. So I think this paper really emphasizes, I guess, those challenges, but I guess also emphasizes the opportunities in terms of virtual fencing going forward. So moving on, I'd like to now just talk a little bit about the technology behind fenceless farming and how it works and the principles behind it. There's certainly been a great uptake of ag tech, and we certainly see the investment in the agricultural technology space is really driving a lot of innovation and opportunities. The extent to which that's really driving benefits is, I guess, yet to be seen. I certainly think there's an awful lot of hype around technologies in the ag tech sector. I was very interested to try and find some of that, the dollar investment in these ag tech startups, and it's certainly in the billions of dollars. I was recently at the Australian National Beef event, which is held every 3 years, and there was this huge interest and resurgence in technologies, digital technologies in particular, whether it's remote tracking of animals or other types of technologies that are going to impact on those livestock industries. I think we have this vision of technology driving a new age of agriculture. And this vision is about data-driven landscape design, where we have cows that text tractors and tractors that share data with farmers with their amazing dashboards, drones flying overhead, and fleets of agribots. The reality is delivering technology and ag tech in these remote landscapes is both challenging and difficult. And certainly virtual fencing is at the cutting edge and at the forefront of the challenges to deliver those technology solutions. So what does, what does virtual fencing or technology look like? Well, we know that there are natural fences in the landscape and animals are responding to natural controls. I guess what virtual fencing aims to do is take on board the natural processes and apply those through an on-animal device that the animals wear, so that we can coordinate their movement in the landscape using this cue and control system. So the automated animal control or precision or low labor precision management utilizes a collar on the animal. This is a virtual fencing collar. And when the animals actually move across the landscape and approach the virtual fence line, they get an audible cue. If they cross that line, there's an electrical stimulation that tries to control and manage them. This stimulus has to be very sophisticated, monitoring using both accelerometers and GPS, detailed movements of the animal to meet both the practical applications as well as the practical implications as well as the social license to operate in terms of welfare standards. So it's a very challenging and very sophisticated piece of technology that has to operate in very remote areas for long periods of time. So the history of virtual fencing has occurred over the last sort of 25 years. I think Dean Anderson at the USDA in the 1990s, along with colleagues at MIT, Daniela Roos and Peter Cork from CSRO, were the original sort of developers of that original technology. I was fortunate enough to spend a bit of time working on virtual fencing technology with Dean Anderson and spend a bit of time with him in Las Cruces in New Mexico. And he had in the back of his shed one of his original virtual fencing collars. And you can see a picture here of this rather large, slightly grotesque device that was fitted to animals in those early days of that technology. Since then, there's been a significant amount of research that's been done around the world. In particular, CSRO in Australia took that technology and really refined the algorithms that were driving that virtual fencing and embedded those on a digital platform that was able to be licensed to Adjacents, which have got a virtual fencing collar now, which is branded under the eShepherd. There are a number of other commercial companies out there. There's the No Fence in Norway, Vents in the US, and Halter in New Zealand, that are all developing or have some sort of web presence where they're developing those technologies. I had spent a bit of time with Adjacents discussing where they're up to, and certainly the collars have made big steps forward. It should be noted that it's a collar, not a tag, as much as the technology providers would like to have a tag. The collar is a preferred sort of format for the actual device. Communication is a really critical component, and a lot of research and effort has been developed around wireless communications with those collars, both for deploying them and monitoring them. There's also been a very strong focus on ensuring that the algorithms meet welfare standards and enable a social license to operate. The collars are still pretty expensive, and the value proposition needs to really span multiple applications. I think what's most interesting, though, at the moment, the greatest interest is around areas around environmental protection, certainly in New Zealand, where water quality is a big issue, and in Australia with the Great Barrier Reef. Those are the sort of application areas that are getting a lot of interest. So the technology is certainly moving forward, but it's certainly not at the stage where we can see lots of applications or lots of uptake at the moment across industries. I think, though, it's important to note that virtual fencing technology is more than just about animal control. The technology has a whole range of different elements that go into it, which can deliver value above and beyond just controlling animals in the landscape. So this includes those distributed sensors, edge computing, algorithms, then linking that through to cloud computing and dedicated user interfaces. The distributed network of those technology stacks, if you like, are maturing and driving a whole heap of new opportunities, going forward. I think what's really important, though, is to think about how fenceless farming is about like driving value for producers. Producers are going to be implementing that, and we really need to think and understand the complexity of those systems. In terms of the, I guess, the key profit drivers, the productivity of those livestock in the landscape are really important, the cost of production, and perhaps also the price of the animals, in the price of the product at the end of the day. This sort of falls in under that profit imperative. And I think the technology maps nicely into those three areas under what we would sort of term the 3 A's. That's algorithms, automation, and authentication. So algorithms are really helping us better understand and describe the production of the animal and optimize the productivity of those animals in the landscape. Automation really is in that area of cost savings. The greater the automation, particularly around labor saving, those opportunities are really important. I think, though, the most important area is around the social license to operate and authentication. The data that's sitting behind the virtual fencing can really help us engage with consumers and help them understand much better where and how the livestock products are being produced. And so that really nicely brings on to the third part of this talk, which is really thinking about people. What fenceless farming means for consumers. I think the complexity of global food supplies has really created, particularly in industrialized agriculture, this disconnect between supply and demand. And I'm going to now just provide some slides and that really talks to, I guess, where that's come from and how that sort of might be really important in shaping where things like virtual fencing might really build a connectivity in the landscape between consumers and producers. So the evolving consumer we've seen is there's some changing demands, and we sort of know about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and the importance it means to us in terms of our sense of physiological wellness and how that translates through safety, belonging, esteem, and self-actualization. But that hierarchy of needs has been applied to a food hierarchy of needs. And we can increasingly see in our modern food environments, if you like, how we've progressed from am I hungry through to is this food safe? What's for dinner this week? What's the latest food trend? And what will my friends think if I eat this? And increasingly, we look around the world to see what interesting foods are available. And it really, foods say something about who we are. It becomes a part of our self-expression. I really like this sort of hierarchy of needs as a backdrop for how we think about consumers and how that drives, I guess, our food production systems. I think we've also seen this increasing abundance of food and I guess the value of food. And if we look at the expenditure as a share of disposable income, just taking the US as an example, we've seen this steady decline. Now, clearly, the actual disposable incomes have increased, and so that's obviously a key factor in there. But food is certainly less valued, and we expect to see this abundance continue on. I think it's sort of interesting because we talk about production increases in productivity. I really like this work by David Pimentel, and where they looked at this sort of shift from people power to fossil fuel power. And if you look through this transition of settlement farming through early labor saving technologies through to low tech labor and then this high tech labor, really what we've optimized in all of those systems is labor efficiencies. And labor efficiency has driven people away from farming. I saw an interesting video recently where Jeremy Clarkson, who has started, got his own farm, and he was talking to this idea that really consumers have no idea what farming really is about. And I think this disconnect is really an important part of how that shapes our landscapes. What's interesting, I sort of wanted to sort of explore this a little bit more, and I try to pull together some ideas around what the income that was spent on food and the people that were employed in agriculture. And we can see this sort of relationship that where food is more critical where food is in less supply, that we see this sort of relationship where the expenditure on food, the connection with food becomes more important. So in terms of virtual fencing and this idea that we can utilize that technology, I think it's about creating a new consumer experience where consumers, I guess, can connect with the animals in the landscape. And so we see that consumers are able to get information about the livestock from the virtual fencing technology. And I think this really does provide a really important element to the technology that's sitting behind virtual fencing. Also, I guess in terms of people and fenceless farming, it's allowing the farmers to get much more information about their business and to take control of their business. It's making today better than yesterday, so that they can make more informed decisions, have confidence in what's happening in their farming systems. So I guess that sort of really wrapped up the three key elements that I really think are really important. So it's really about the landscape and the animals in the landscape. It's about that technology component, but it's also about the broader community and the opportunity to get involved. And in that history I provided of where virtual fencing sits in the landscape, I've sort of demonstrated that we've gone for the last sort of 25 years where technology has been developed and moving forward. I find it really interesting when we look at the sort of technology adoption. We always hope and believe that it's going to move much more quickly than it actually does. I was really interested looking back on a technology in Northern Australia that's become really key and critical to the productivity of the beef production systems. And that was the introduction of Brahmin cattle into Northern Australia. So Brahmin cattle were introduced in the 1930s. But if you actually look at this uptake in this technology, it really didn't start sort of really taking effect until the 1950s and 1960s. And what I was able to do was to pull together some information where we looked at one particular research facility in central Queensland and looked at the investment in that technology, the numbers of publications, and also the numbers of visitors that were coming through, and particular producers. And what we really see as technology starts to get adopted is that the industries ask really important questions and they start connecting and start driving the agenda going forward. And I think virtual fencing really is at that cusp where we've seen a significant amount of investment in the technology, where it's now getting to the point where it's starting to really be able to deliver solutions. I don't think industry is really fully adopting that technology at this point in time. And it's now about opening up that conversation. I think it would be really great to see that conversation move away from just being about producers and the technology, but bringing consumers along on that journey so that we can provide trusted data, trusted information to tell this story about where food is coming from, and that they can be directly involved in thinking about and shaping future landscapes. So that really sort of talks to this idea of redefining connections to shape a new landscape. So it's about that. It's about thinking about how landscapes might look from everybody's perspectives. And probably the technology about controlling animals in the landscape is one part of that technology. What that looks like when we remove those fences will also be important, but it will also be about how consumers and farmers can interact to have a shared vision for those future landscapes. So fenceless farming is an age of digital connections. We've talked about this technology, this consumers and these producers coming together in this way to really drive a new agenda of digital connections. I think we're going to see these inputs and outputs that's going to shape that future landscape. And I think that future landscape is all about really enabling a democratized vision of, I guess, thinking about and understanding what that landscape looks like. It's about allowing new systems to be developed, refined, evolve, and then testing them in the future. And it's giving all stakeholders the opportunity to be part of that conversation. Now, I'm not sure what the inputs are going to be in terms of the technology, but I really like the way Chris talked and the conversation that we spoke about in the earlier session really talked to this idea that it was less about this scientist driving this agenda, that it was much more about a partnership. And I think that partnership spreads across the scientific disciplines, thinking in systems in a much more holistic way. But I think it expands out above and beyond just our science and research. It's about thinking about new people that can come into these conversations. It's the designers, the developers, maybe economists, software engineers that all have a stake in helping redefine what those systems might look like. I don't know what the outputs are going to look like, but they are going to be different from what from our current farming systems. We're thinking about it in terms of genetics and genetic improvement, and how we can actually optimize locally, and we can have much more diversified phenotypes in the landscape. Traditionally, we've taken technology has taken, researchers have taken our ideas, we take them into our research institutions, we refine, develop them, and then in a more homogenized way, spread them across the landscape as a single solution. Now all farmers can become researchers in their own right and develop this much more diversified landscape where it's built upon local knowledge rather than this diversified knowledge. I suspect the supply chains in terms of the individuals involved in it will be the same, but what we'll have is shorter supply chains in terms of knowledge and information. We'll have a much greater connectivity. This will hopefully lead to much more responsive landscapes with greater resilience and greater use of data-driven decisions that really drive those going forward. So some final thoughts. I wonder why moose, whether they would ever go extinct. The males are impressive. They have huge antlers. They demonstrate significant evolutionary refinement. You would imagine that they should be fine. However, confusing symbols with reality can have bad consequences. The application of technology systems needs to be grounded in solid research, and researchers are really going to be critical for shaping the future of digital technologies as they shape landscapes. Virtual fencing is certainly at the cutting edge of I guess, the challenges associated with those digital technologies. I think it's certainly going to be really interesting to see how we come together to really, I guess, reshape and rethink what landscapes might look like. So thanks very much. Thank you, Sandy.
Thanks, Dave. That's a really interesting talk. Never thought about fenceless stuff before. It seemed really weird to me. I'd like to open the session up to questions. I have one on chat from Anne Stephen, and she's asking, do you think ag tech is disconnecting people with land and animals even more? So a farmer sitting at home behind a computer screen rather than being out on the farm, and will there be fewer farm staff out there as well?
So I think there is the risk that there will be that disconnect, although it could also, you know, the information, the data that sits behind the ag tech could actually drive a much greater awareness of critical issues, health and welfare, for example. If we get some early warnings, early indication of animals that are exhibiting behaviors that could be compromising their health and welfare, it allows us to much more easily target those animals and get directly involved. And I also think in terms of that sort of social license to operate, data can underpin and make a connection with consumers so that they can also be directly involved in, you know, a much more transparent and open system. So in some ways, you know, perhaps it's giving more targeted oversight of what's going on rather than, you know, actually having to be seeing all animals every day just in case there's some issue. So there is a risk that it could potentially create this. So I think there will be some adaptations that are required so that we don't miss the critical things that are going on. But potentially it could also, I guess, add more value to the to that oversight.
I guess I've got a question in the sense that is it sort of like going back to the future? If you think of developed countries and other bits, under third world countries and stuff like that, they still have their shepherds and they know exactly where their cattle are, and they forage, graze all over the place without any boundaries. Do you envisage sort of something more like that with a fenceless sort of operation? You sort of go back to that sort of landscape, if you like?
Yeah, I think that's it sort of opens up those opportunities. It's interesting that Anderson's, when they sort of named their product, they called it the e-shepherd. So this sense of having that oversight, and if you have the conversations with them, their value proposition, whilst it is about managing livestock in the landscape, it's actually about probably the greater opportunities around monitoring. I think this this ability to start removing fences, but still knowing that you can access your animals and can do things like mustering those animals at critical points in time, it gives you that ability to do that. But I think where we see those challenges where grazing resources, sort of climatic drivers, grazing resources at the landscape level are highly variable, and the ability for farms to be able to be able to access those resources at critical periods of time. You know, I'm sort of brought to my mindset the wildebeests in East Africa, the way they migrate and move with the rainfall, and I think this whole interest in regenerative agriculture, this importance of livestock in this more intensive sort of grazing scenario where you get larger numbers that are concentrated, the opportunities to realize that are huge. Now, clearly, to get to that point will require significant changes in the way we actually construct our agricultural businesses, where there has to be a greater degree of cooperation and collaboration, where you could have, you know, owners of animals that are not owners of the land and vice versa. But once you start to break down that paradigm and you start to accept that, you know, the opportunity, or realize that there is this opportunity to manage animals at the landscape level, then it sort of opens up this opportunity for a greater engagement from the broader community. For example, in ownership of livestock, you know, no longer is there this requirement that you have to own the land, have this fence around your block of land to be able to be farming. You can actually have these situations where you can, you know, virtually own livestock and be involved in that farming and set an agenda in terms of those landscape drivers. So I think it's, I think the opportunities are, you know, at the moment, I think that people are thinking about it very much in the context of the traditional sort of mindset of maybe removing some internal fences, but it's when you start removing those between farm fences that you really start opening up those possibilities. Again, I think it's interesting to see as well that the focus at the moment, those opportunities around riparian management, linked to sediment and nutrient and cattle accessing those riparian areas. Certainly in Northern Australia, those catchments that feed into the barrier reef, it's a very expensive business to fence off those riparian areas. Flood events wash out those fences. And so virtual fencing delivering environmental benefits makes an awful lot of sense. And so immediately that's about the broader community driving some benefits in terms of environmental outcomes. This, again, this social license to operate. But, you know, in addition to keeping the animals away, we can actually demonstrate that we kept the animals away because we're monitoring them on a continuous basis. So I think, yeah, there's some huge opportunities there.
Thank you. Do you think there'll be some anxiety though around that whole paradigm shift? Obviously, with anything like that, anything new, in the sense that, you know, people are used to looking at land ownership and the farm next door being quite separate from them via a fence. If you suddenly were able to open that up and have that kind of interaction and other bits and pieces like that, do you think people, you know, what happens if it breaks down, or if you don't have good internet, or you don't, you know, all of those wireless services and stuff? Do you think that might cause some issues? So
I think there are two parts to that question. I think there's the people part and the technology part. Mm-hmm. So I think that the people part is quite significant in the sense that, you know, it does require a shift in the way we do things and the way we think about ownership. And, you know, in some ways, you know, I guess that starting out with the tragedy of the commons, the challenges of the tragedy of the commons is, you know, trust. And I guess that sort of links in quite nicely to your second part of your question around the technology is is a technology robust enough to drive trust so that we can actually utilize it? Now, there are unquestionably some ongoing challenges, but all the time we see, the Internet of Things is an emerging area where we see this sensorized landscapes, where we have this connectivity, is becoming really, really an important driver for some of these technologies. And I certainly think that in Northern Australia, where the distance and the vagaries of distance and connectivity it's probably as bad as anywhere in the world, yet we are seeing some innovative solutions, and we're always pushing the boundaries, and that it's not stopping and limiting. Well, it is, there are limitations, but it's certainly not stopping this desire for this technological uptake. I think once we stop talking about ag tech, and it just becomes ubiquitous as part of this farming system, and we trust it, then I think that provides the nice follow-on to the next stage, where we're changing our systems. I think it's interesting when you look at Brahmin, the introduction of Brahmin cattle, and when I reviewed and demonstrated how long it took, we always want things to go more quickly than in reality they take. And I think part of that more quickly is the people part. And I think that's where we're moving now. When the technology is maturing, there's still more work to be done, but we're increasingly getting closer to this people challenges. And that's about conferences like this, opening up that conversation and thinking more broadly. And I think integral to that, and again, referring back to Chris's earlier talk, this notion that we think more holistically, that we bring a broader group of stakeholders on board. This democratization of knowledge and research, data, is reshaping many areas of society. I mean, YouTube provides a valuable learning resource now that universities once were the sole controllers of. I think that democratization, people will respond to that. They'll want to be part of it, and it will shape it. But I think it is about the technology, trusting the technology, and then the people trust in terms of delivering to those broader landscape opportunities.
Great, thank you. I've got a question from Penny Timmer, but she's just had to duck out, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Animal welfare policy is informed by science, but is ultimately a societal expectation influenced by values, such as culture, religion, politics, economics. You talk about transparency, but some of these companies are using language like pulse rather than electric shock. Do you think consumers will accept shock collars on farm animals in place of stockmanship? Acknowledging the additional data collected can also inform better health decisions.
I mean, I think it's cost benefits, and I think it's about transparency. And I think, in the past, maybe there's this desire from agriculture to this metaphorical fence that we put around our farms to keep the consumer away, because there are things that go on that, that disconnect means that we have concerns over. And I'm not saying they're not legitimate concerns and that we don't need to be dealing with them. But I think for consumers to become educated, informed about the costs and the benefits, and understanding how the technology actually operates, and seeing what that actually means in a very transparent and open way. And of course, I totally take on board the point that this idea of pulse rather than shock is a way of trying to, take away this idea of that it's this aversion that people will have to electric shocks. We have electric fences, and I think consumers would be comfortable with that. The reality is, in most instances, animals learn very quickly to respond to the audible sound that gives them a cue. And so a lot of work has gone into that. And the research, I will say that the CSIRO welfare researchers based down in Armidale, did a lot of work in terms of actually taking, physiological measures of the animal's stress response to those shock systems. And again, I think making that available so people can actually see. But ultimately, consumers, society has to make some of those decisions, and having the data available so that they can engage in that conversation, I think will be very, very important part of that conversation. So I probably haven't answered the question in the sense of what's right or wrong. I do think though that technology does open up this opportunity. And I think the other part to this is it's allowing livestock farmers that are farming in the landscape to tell their unique individual story. I think the wine industry has done an amazing job of telling their stories and creating a brand. I think the technology is unlocking the opportunity for, livestock in the landscape to tell their story and connect with their consumer that relates to that story. So I think the opportunities are huge.
Well, it's a really interesting.
Sorry, Sandy. I just had a comment. Just had to make sure it was all good. I'm really interested about the comment you made about the riparian zones and fenceless farming, because here in Canterbury we've just had a lot of big floods, which has taken out a lot of the fencing along our rivers, which these areas have to be fenced by government legislation. So, do you see a role of government and legislation to not necessarily force, but help facilitate the use of this technology?
Yeah, look, I was on record in saying in the early or mid 2000s, we did, what was interesting was the original research work in central Queensland that I was a key part of was actually funded through the Department for Environment, and it was focused on those riparian areas. And I always maintain that the cost of this technology in terms of productivity, it's difficult to make the case. But the cost in terms of environmental protection, where governments step in and, whether it's legislation or provide some sort of incentivization to help farmers adopt that technology, has benefits in both ways. It protects the environment, but it also creates a technology or creates an environment where producers can start to actually utilize that technology more broadly in their production systems. So, I spoke with the Adjuson's team, and they are absolutely clear that is their first big opportunity. And I know that they're certainly looking to the New Zealand water quality, the legislation around that to be able to provide a solution that can address some of these challenges of things like flooding events, washing out those water courses, and having that greater degree of flexibility that the virtual fencing technology provides. So I actually think this is a great opportunity. Whether it's realized, I don't know. I hope so, because I think governments can help, not only protect the environment, but also give farmers the opportunities to step into these technologies, and that will increasingly enable the cost of the technologies to start to drop, and for those producers to start using it across their production system in a much more flexible way. So I hope so, but definitely I think it should be an opportunity.
No, fantastic. That's a really good comment. And I could see that there's a potential benefit in other countries where we have those migration patterns of the bigger animals that have been stopped by fences, that if we move to something like a fenceless system, that's allowing those animals to have their migration pathways. So I think there is a huge opportunity globally for this kind of technology. So thank you very much for your talk.
Yeah, thanks for that, Cameron. Yeah, I agree. I do think that the opportunities to reimagine the landscape and think about the migratory animals, as well as, livestock utilizing the foraging resources, trying to address things like droughts in Australia. How can we more flexibly utilize the grazing resources, utilizing the technology? I think the real opportunity for researchers now is to start to ask those questions using simulation, because I think they are big questions, and the experiments required to really start to address those sorts of questions are quite challenging. So the opportunity to utilize GIS frameworks, mapping frameworks, where we can run those scenarios from historical data and explore, what the scale of the fence removal might need to be able to address a range of different solutions, to start to show how that landscape might be reshaped. Because at the moment, I think it's very much thought bubbles, and they're interesting, but where and how and what strategically can we do to remove fencing and utilize virtual fencing in that broader environment? So I think that to me is the next step. We don't need to actually be running these experiments. We can actually look at real landscapes and explore how they might be reshaped.
That's great, thank you. Has anybody else got any further comment? I think we've probably still got a couple more minutes.
So Anna's got one here, which is, do you think virtual fencing coped to be allied to keeping wild animals like deer out of areas you're trying to restore ecologically using, could be applied, sorry, to keeping wild animals like deer out of areas you are trying to restore ecologically using deterrent sound? It's interesting, and I might be wrong in this. So I know certainly cattle have been the predominant species that the virtual fencing has been developed for, and that's largely because the collar form factor, with all of the technology that is required, is probably the only way. I think for sheep, for example, it would be a little heavy. I don't know of any work that it's been utilized on things like deer. Again, I think part of the challenge is, keeping that technology on the animal, maintaining it, and keeping it functional, particularly for animals that are prone to, going through fences and catching them and making sure that the welfare of the animal is protected. So I think it does offer opportunities, but maybe the technology, the form factor needs to be slightly reduced going forward. Interestingly enough, I think the actual virtual fencing technology at the moment is probably focused much more on just the on-animal technology. I think integrating it with things like walk-over-way systems, where animals are monitored when they come to water, and auto drafting, so that you can actually draft off animals that need attention to the devices, so that you're building a number of technologies and integrating them together, is probably where some of those practical considerations get dealt with.